April 18, 1945. In the shadow of the bombed-out Krupp factory complex near Essen, Germany, Hauptmann Werner Müller stood with arms folded across his chest, watching with unconcealed skepticism as the American convoy approached. The Wehrmacht Panzer officer was certain these Americans would treat their German prisoners with the same contempt his propaganda officers had promised. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Müller and his fellow officers couldn't possibly anticipate was how their fundamental beliefs about racial hierarchy, technical superiority, and the nature of warfare itself would be dismantled in the coming weeks. The spring air carried the smell of diesel and burnt metal as 5 olive-drab trucks lumbered into the factory yard. Third Army units had captured this maintenance facility just days earlier, finding dozens of disabled Panther and Tiger tanks abandoned by retreating German forces. Now the Americans were bringing in specialists to evaluate the German armor. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison stepped down from the lead jeep, surveying the scene before him. At 43, Harrison had spent nearly 20 years in the U.S. Army, the last 3 commanding the 761st Tank Battalion, the all-black unit known as the Black Panthers. Despite earning a Distinguished Service Cross during fierce fighting in the Ardennes, Harrison knew that his men continued to battle prejudice from within their own army as much as they had fought the Germans. "Sergeant Washington," Harrison called out to his maintenance chief, "get your men unloaded and start the assessment. I want to know which of these can be operational by tomorrow." Technical Sergeant Eugene Washington, a stocky man from Detroit who had been a master mechanic at General Motors before the war, nodded sharply. "Yes, sir." He turned to the trucks where 30 men of the 761st's maintenance company were already jumping to the ground, their faces serious under their helmets. Washington had handpicked these men from hundreds in the battalion. Before the war, they had been mechanics, engineers, and factory workers, skilled technicians who were often limited to janitorial positions because of their skin color back home. The Army had reluctantly given them a chance to use their real skills, and they had repeatedly proven themselves under combat conditions. Captain Miller, the senior American intelligence officer assigned to the facility, approached Harrison with a clipboard. "Sir, we have 23 Wehrmacht maintenance personnel as POWs, 8 officers, 15 enlisted. The German commander is Hauptmann Müller over there." He nodded toward the German officer. "Have they been cooperative?" Harrison asked. "Technically, yes," Miller replied, "but they haven't volunteered anything useful. They're following the letter of the Geneva Convention, while giving us as little as possible." Harrison nodded. "Understood. Let's see if we can change that dynamic." The Germans watched with a mixture of curiosity and disdain as the black American soldiers organized themselves into teams and began unloading equipment. Among the observing German officers, Oberleutnant Karl Schmidt leaned toward Müller and spoke in a low voice. "They're sending their Negroes to work on German tanks," he said in German, his voice carrying a hint of disbelief. "Do they think so little of our engineering?" Müller shushed him with a subtle gesture. "Watch what you say. That American colonel might understand German." Across the yard, Sergeant Washington was already organizing his teams. "Jones, Phillips, take Team 1 and start with those Panthers in the corner. Miller, Thompson, your team handles the Tigers. The rest of you split up on those Panzer Rifles. I want diagnostic reports in 30 minutes. The Germans watched with barely disguised incredulity as the black American soldiers moved with practiced efficiency among the massive tanks. Many of these men had been working with captured German equipment since the Normandy campaign, and they had developed systematic procedures for assessment and repair. Corporal William "Smitty" Smith, a former railroad mechanic from Chicago, led his team toward a massive Tiger tank that sat with its engine compartment exposed. He ran his hand appreciatively along the thick armor plating. "Beautiful machine," he muttered. "Terrible purpose, but beautiful engineering." Private First Class Robert Johnson, the youngest of the maintenance crew at just 19, whistled softly. "Look at the size of this thing compared to our Shermans. No wonder they call it a Tiger." "Size ain't everything," Smitty replied with a knowing smile. "Remember what Sergeant Washington always says? A complex machine just means more things to break," they finished in unison, laughing. The German POWs observed this exchange with growing confusion. These were not the undisciplined, incompetent soldiers they had been told to expect. The Americans moved with purpose and clear expertise around the German armored vehicles. After 30 minutes, Sergeant Washington collected the initial reports from his team leaders. The news was not good. Fuel systems deliberately sabotaged, ignition components removed or damaged, transmissions partially disassembled. The retreating Germans had done their best to ensure these tanks wouldn't be easily turned against them. Washington approached Lieutenant Colonel Harrison with his findings. "They did a number on these, sir. Not destroyed, but carefully disabled. They expected these would eventually be recovered by their own forces." Harrison nodded. "How long to get them running?" "With parts." Washington considered. 3 days for the Panthers, maybe 5 for the Tigers. Those Maybach engines are complicated beasts." "You have 2 days, Sergeant," Harrison said firmly. "Headquarters wants at least 5 operational for transport to Aberdeen Proving Grounds." Washington didn't flinch. "Yes, sir, we'll make it happen." Harrison turned to Captain Miller. "I want to speak with the German commander." Minutes later, Hauptmann Müller stood at attention before Harrison, his face impassive despite being a prisoner. Through an interpreter, Harrison addressed him directly. "My men will be repairing your tanks. We would appreciate any technical assistance your maintenance personnel might provide," Harrison said, his tone professional and devoid of any hint of superiority or condescension. Miller's eyes flickered briefly with surprise at the request. He had expected demands, not an invitation to collaborate. After a moment's hesitation, he responded stiffly, "My men will provide information as required under the convention, but I cannot compel them to actively assist the enemy." Harrison nodded, unsurprised. "Of course. However, if any of your men wish to volunteer their expertise, they will be treated with respect and given extra rations." The mention of extra food did not go unnoticed. Many of the German soldiers had been on reduced rations for months as the Reich's supply lines collapsed. Still, Müller remained non-committal, simply inclining his head slightly in acknowledgement. As the American officer walked away, Oberleutnant Schmidt approached Müller again. "They cannot possibly repair our tanks," he said quietly. "Not without proper documentation and specialized tools, and certainly not these." He paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound openly contemptuous. "These colored troops." Müller wasn't so certain. "We will see," he replied. By mid-afternoon, the maintenance yard had transformed into a hive of activity. The American soldiers had erected portable work lamps to extend their working hours, and trucks had arrived with spare parts commandeered from other captured German facilities. Technical manuals, some captured, others supplied by intelligence officers who had been studying German armor for years, were consulted as the teams worked. Sergeant Washington moved between the teams, offering guidance, solving problems, and occasionally demonstrating techniques. Under a Tiger tank, he lay shoulder to shoulder with Corporal Smith examining the complicated transmission assembly. "See that?" Washington pointed with his wrench. "They've removed the synchronizing gears, but look here." He directed Smith's attention to markings on the housing. "The Germans number everything. This sequence tells us exactly which components go where." Smith nodded appreciatively. "They're thorough, I'll give them that." "Their thoroughness is our advantage," Washington replied. "Everything's documented, everything's precise. In some ways, it makes our job easier." By evening, the Americans had made surprising progress. 2 Panzer IVs had been successfully started, their engines rumbling to life in the twilight. The sound drew the attention of the German prisoners, who exchanged surprised glances as the distinctive roar of the German engines filled the yard. Feldwebel Hans Wagner, the senior non-commissioned officer among the German prisoners, couldn't contain his curiosity. He approached the American guard and, in broken English, asked to speak with someone in charge. Captain Miller brought him to Sergeant Washington, who was wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "He wants to know how you got the engines running," Miller explained. "Apparently, they sabotaged the fuel injection systems." Washington smiled slightly. "Tell him we reversed the sabotage," he said simply. Then, noticing the German's genuine technical interest, he added, "Ask him if he'd like to see." When Miller translated, Wagner nodded eagerly. Washington led them to one of the running tanks and pointed to the engine compartment. Your men disconnected the fuel lines here and here, Washington explained, pointing as Miller translated. Then they cross-connected these feeds to ensure air would enter the system and create vapor lock. It's clever, but once we understood the pattern, it was easy to correct. Wagner's expression remained neutral, but his eyes widened slightly. He asked a question, which Miller translated. He wants to know how you figured out the pattern without documentation. Washington tapped his temple. I worked on BMW motorcycle engines before the war. Different scale, similar philosophy. German engineers think alike. This was translated, and Wagner stood silent for a long moment before asking another question. Miller turned to Washington. He wants to know if you need help with the Panthers. He says there's a trick to the cooling system that isn't in the manuals. Washington exchanged a glance with Captain Miller, who nodded slightly. Tell him we'd appreciate his expertise, Washington said. That night, as the American soldiers set up field kitchens and prepared for an evening meal, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison received an unexpected request. 3 German POWs, led by Feldwebel Wagner, had volunteered to assist with the repairs. They asked only for the promised extra rations and the opportunity to work on the machines they had spent years maintaining. Harrison approved the request immediately. Keep them under guard, but give them some latitude to work, he instructed Washington. This could be valuable. The next morning brought an unusual scene. American and German soldiers working side by side on the massive tanks. Initial wariness quickly gave way to professional respect as technical knowledge transcended national boundaries. The Germans were visibly surprised by the Americans' competence, while the Americans found their German counterparts to be less fanatical than expected, just ordinary men who happened to be skilled mechanics. By mid-morning, more German POWs had volunteered, drawn by both the extra food and the almost magnetic pull of their professional pride. Even Oberleutnant Schmidt found himself describing the proper timing sequence for a Panther's ignition system to a group of attentive American soldiers. Hauptmann Müller observed this collaboration with complex emotions. As a Wehrmacht officer, he had been steeped in the Reich's racial ideology. Yet here were men his propaganda had dismissed as inferior, demonstrating mastery over Germany's most advanced military technology. More disturbing still was how easily his own men seemed to set aside years of indoctrination when faced with the simple reality of shared technical challenges. During the lunch break, Miller approached Washington as the sergeant sat checking a repair manual. The German officer stood silently for a moment before speaking in accented but clear English. "Your men work quickly," he said, making it sound almost like an accusation. Washington looked up, measuring the German officer before responding. "We've had practice, been fixing things all our lives." "You have worked on German tanks before?" "Some. Mostly we learned on American tanks. But machinery is machinery." Miller frowned slightly. "German engineering is considered the finest in the world." Washington's expression remained neutral. "Every machine has its strengths and weaknesses. Your Panthers have excellent armor and firepower, but the final drives fail after about 150 kilometers. Your Tigers are powerful, but too heavy for many bridges and consume too much fuel." Miller stiffened at this matter-of-fact assessment of German flaws. "And I suppose American tanks are perfect." Washington actually chuckled at this. "Far from it. Our Shermans are undergunned and under-armored compared to yours, but they're reliable, easy to fix, and we have thousands of them. While your men wait weeks for replacement parts, we just replace the whole tank." The simplicity of this statement seemed to unsettle Miller more than any boast might have. Before he could respond, a commotion near one of the Tigers drew their attention. A Panther's massive engine had roared to life, black diesel smoke belching from its exhaust. Standing proudly beside it were 2 American soldiers and 1 German POW, all with identical expressions of satisfaction on their oil-smeared faces. "That's 3, Washington said, making a mark on his clipboard. "We'll have the 5 Colonel Harrison wants by tomorrow morning." Miller looked at him sharply. "That is not possible. The sabotage was thorough." Washington met his gaze steadily. "With respect, sir, you underestimate both my men and yours. Your mechanics have professional pride. Once they started helping, progress accelerated." Later that afternoon, the restoration effort hit a significant obstacle, One of the Tiger tanks had a damaged engine block, a crack that would normally require complete replacement of the massive Maybach engine. The German specialists declared it irreparable under field conditions. Sergeant Washington studied the damage carefully, then consulted with Corporal Smith and Private Johnson. After a brief discussion, Johnson hurried off to one of the trucks, while Smith began clearing space around the damaged area. Oberleutnant Schmidt watched this with skeptical interest. When Johnson returned with a portable welding rig, Schmidt shook his head dismissively. "Impossible," he declared to Wagner in German. "You cannot weld that alloy under these conditions. It requires factory equipment." Wagner translated this for Washington, who merely shrugged. "We'll see," he responded, nodding to Johnson. "Show them what you can do, Private." Johnson, who had been a shipyard welder in Baltimore before the war, set to work with quiet concentration. He carefully prepared the damaged area, preheating the metal to prevent stress fractures, then began the delicate process of filling the crack. His welding torch moved with surgical precision, the arc casting harsh shadows across his focused face. The Germans watched with growing interest as Johnson worked. After 30 minutes of meticulous effort, he shut off his torch and stepped back. "It'll hold," he said with quiet confidence. "Not permanent, but it'll get this tank wherever it needs to go." Wagner inspected the weld closely, running a calloused finger along its length. He looked up at Schmidt and spoke rapid German. Schmidt appeared surprised, then reluctantly impressed. He turned to Washington. "Feldwebel Wagner says it is good work," he admitted. He would not have believed it possible outside a factory. Washington nodded. "Johnson worked on Liberty ships. When you're welding on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, you learn to make repairs hold under any conditions." By nightfall, 4 of the tanks were operational, with the 5th, Johnson's welded Tiger, undergoing final testing. The yard was filled with the rumble of German engines, now serving American purposes. The day's shared labor had created an unusual atmosphere among captors and captives. While still adversaries in the broader conflict, in this limited domain of machines and repairs, they had found common ground. As darkness fell, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison called Sergeant Washington aside. "Headquarters just radioed," he said in a low voice. "Change of plans. They want these tanks operational, but not for transport to Aberdeen." Washington raised an eyebrow. "Sir, there's a German counterattack expected 15 miles from here. Some SS units trying to break through to relieve pressure on Berlin. They want these tanks as part of the response force." Washington absorbed this information. "Our men driving German tanks into battle. That's going to be confusing for both sides." Harrison nodded grimly. "They'll be repainted with American stars, of course. But I need your assessment. Are they combat ready?" Washington considered carefully. "The Panzer IVs and Panthers, yes. The Tigers could manage, but I wouldn't trust that welded block in sustained combat. I need drivers and gunners who can handle these machines. Your maintenance crews know them best by now." Washington understood the implication. "Sir, my men are mechanics, not tankers." "Many of them were trained on tanks before being assigned to maintenance," Harrison pointed out. "And right now, they know these German tanks better than anyone else in the Allied forces." Washington knew this was true. Though assigned to maintenance, many of his men had initially trained as tank operators before the Army decided their mechanical skills were more valuable in support roles. Some, like Corporal Smith, had even seen combat in earlier campaigns. "I'll ask for volunteers," Washington said finally. "How soon do they need to move out?" "Dawn," Harrison replied. "I want 4 tanks minimum, fully crewed and ready to move. They'll join a mixed force of Shermans and tank destroyers near Duisburg." Washington saluted. "We'll be ready, sir." As Washington walked back to his men, he noticed Hauptmann Müller standing alone, staring at the now silent German tanks under the harsh work lights. The German officer's expression was distant, contemplative. "Tomorrow these will fight against your forces," Washington said, stopping beside him. It wasn't a taunt, merely a statement of fact. Müller didn't look at him. "It does not matter," he said quietly. "The war is lost, has been for months now." He paused. "But we were taught that men like you could never master German technology. That you were—" He hesitated, unwilling to voice the crude racial terminology of Nazi propaganda. "Inferior." Washington supplied the word calmly. Müller had the grace to look uncomfortable. Yes, that is what they said. Washington was silent for a moment. Before this war, I couldn't get hired as anything but a janitor at the factories where I trained your mechanics today. After, I don't know what waits for us back home. He looked at the German officer. But for now, we fixed your tanks. And tomorrow we'll use them to help end this war. You said German machines have weaknesses, Müller said suddenly. The left side of the Panzers turret has thinner armor. The driver's vision port on the Tiger is vulnerable to direct hits. He was offering combat intelligence, a significant breach of his military oath. Washington studied him carefully. Why tell me this? Müller finally turned to face him. Because you have earned professional respect. And because every day this war continues, more Germans and more Americans die for nothing. Washington nodded slowly, understanding all that remained unsaid. I'll keep your men safe here, he promised, whatever happens tomorrow. Technical Sergeant, Corporal Smith's voice called from across the yard. We've got that Tiger running smooth as silk. Washington gave Müller a parting nod and walked toward his men, already planning how to transform a maintenance crew into tank operators overnight. Behind him, Müller watched the American sergeant's retreating form, his worldview shifting in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. As midnight approached, volunteers had been selected and organized into tank crews. 4 tanks would move out at dawn, 2 Panthers and 2 Panzer I-4s. The massive Tiger, despite Johnson's skilled welding, was deemed too unreliable for combat operations. It would remain at the facility for further study. In the cramped confines of a Panther's turret, Corporal Smith guided Private Johnson through the gunner's controls. Different from our Shermans, he explained. The traverse is electrical rather than hydraulic. Smoother, but if power fails, you're stuck. Johnson nodded, absorbing everything. Like many of the men, he had received tank operator training before being shunted to maintenance duties. Now that initial training was being hastily refreshed and adapted to German equipment. What about the language? Johnson asked, pointing to the German labels on every switch and dial. Already handled, Smith replied, showing him a set of handwritten labels in English that would be attached to the critical controls. We work fast. Outside, Sergeant Washington supervised as the tanks were hastily painted with American identification markings. White stars now adorned the turrets and sides of the German machines, a surreal sight that embodied the strange collaboration of the past 2 days. In the command tent, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison reviewed maps with his officers, planning the tank's route to the rendezvous point. The German POWs had been secured in a separate area for the night, though most had volunteered additional technical advice before being confined. Feldwebel Wagner had been particularly helpful, providing detailed notes on the operational quirks of each vehicle. The second Panther pulls to the left when accelerating, he had explained through an interpreter. The compensator needs adjustment, but there's no time. The driver must be aware. As the final preparations continued through the night, a peculiar atmosphere settled over the facility. Former enemies had worked side by side, united by the universal language of machinery. American soldiers who had faced discrimination their entire lives had demonstrated mastery over the prized technology of a regime built on racial supremacy. And now, in the war's final days, they would take that mastery into battle. Before trying to get a few hours of sleep, Sergeant Washington made a final inspection round. At the Tiger tank, the one deemed too unreliable for combat, he found Private Johnson making adjustments to his welded repair. You should be resting, Washington said. You're assigned to the 1st Panther at 0500. Johnson looked up from his work. Almost done. Sergeant, just reinforcing this weld. It bothers me leaving it half finished. Washington nodded, understanding the professional pride. 5 minutes, then hit your bunk. Yes, Sergeant. Johnson paused. Do you think this will make any difference? Us driving their tanks against them? Washington considered the question. Militarily, a small one. 4 tanks won't change the course of the war. He looked around at the facility, at the evidence of the last 2 days' work. But in other ways, maybe it makes a bigger difference than we can see right now. Johnson nodded thoughtfully and returned to his welding. Washington continued his rounds, checking on his men and the machines they would stake their lives on come morning. The war was nearly over. Everyone knew that. but the final days could still exact a terrible price. As he completed his circuit and prepared to get some rest himself, Washington noticed a solitary figure standing in the shadows near the facility's gate. It was Hauptmann Müller, apparently unable to sleep, gazing out into the darkness toward the east, toward the failing Reich and all it had represented. Washington considered approaching him, but decided against it. Some reckonings were private matters. Instead, he turned toward his own quarters, knowing the dawn would bring its own challenges. 4 German tanks with American stars and black American crews would soon advance against the forces that had built them, embodying a contradiction that would have been unthinkable years earlier. The machines of the self-proclaimed master race would now be turned against them by men they had deemed inferior, men who had proved their mastery through skill rather than ideology. As Sergeant Washington finally lay down for a few hours of rest, he reflected on the strange turns of war and fate. Tomorrow would bring combat and danger, but also a kind of poetic justice that no propaganda on either side could have anticipated. The tanks would speak for themselves, and the men who operated them would write their own chapter in the war's closing narrative. In the darkness of the maintenance yard, the restored German tanks sat silently, their engines cooling, their new American markings barely visible in the dim security lighting. By morning, they would be weapons of war again, but weapons whose very operation now told a different story than their creators had intended. April 19, 1945. Dawn was approaching, and with it, the next phase of this unexpected journey through the machinery of war and the mechanics of human prejudice. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as the tank crews assembled for their final briefing before departure. The metal beasts they would command, once symbols of German technical superiority and now testimonies to American adaptability, waited silently for the day to begin in earnest. April 19, 1945. The German countryside was shrouded in a light morning mist as the 4 tanks, 2 Panthers and 2 Panzer IVs, rumbled along the road toward Duisburg. American white stars now adorned their hulls and turrets, a strange sight on machines designed to destroy Allied forces. Inside the lead Panther, Sergeant Washington peered through the commander's vision port, scanning the horizon for signs of enemy movement. The tank's interior smelled of oil, metal, and sweat, familiar scents to any tanker, regardless of nationality. "How's she handling, Corporal?" Washington asked over the intercom. From the driver's position, Corporal Smith responded, "Smooth, Sergeant. Different from our Shermans, more responsive in the turns, but the clutch is heavier." In the gunner's seat, Private Johnson tracked the road ahead through his sight. "Visibility's good. These German optics are better than ours." "Just remember what Feldwebel Wagner told us," Washington reminded them. "The turret traverse can stick if you move it too quickly. Ease into your target." The small convoy maintained a steady pace toward the rendezvous point, where they would join a larger American force. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison followed in a jeep, maintaining radio contact with headquarters. The operation had been hastily planned, but intelligence suggested it could be crucial. A group of SS Panzer units was attempting to break through Allied lines to establish a corridor toward Berlin. Back at the maintenance facility, the German POWs had been gathered in the mess hall under guard. Their mood was subdued as they ate their morning rations. Many had mixed feelings about the tanks they had helped repair now being used against their countrymen, but few harbored any illusions about the war's outcome at this late stage. Hauptmann Müller sat alone, picking at his food without much appetite. Oberleutnant Schmidt approached and sat across from him, speaking in a low voice. "The guards say those tanks are heading toward Duisburg," Schmidt said. "Elements of the 9th SS Panzer are reported in that area." Müller looked up. "Doesn't matter. The war is over, Karl. Has been for months." Schmidt leaned closer. "But sending Negro troops to operate our tanks, it's an insult." "Is it?" Müller asked quietly. "They repaired in 2 days what our teams couldn't fix in 2 weeks under ideal conditions. What does that tell you about the Reich's theories of racial superiority?" Schmidt stared at him in shock. "Werner, that's dangerous talk." "We are prisoners of war in a collapsing Reich," Müller replied flatly. "Everything is dangerous now." He pushed his plate away. "Did you watch them work? Really watch them?" "That Sergeant Washington, he understood the Maybach engine better than our own mechanics. The young one with the welding torch performed repairs our manuals claim are impossible outside a factory. It changes nothing, Schmidt insisted. Müller gave a hollow laugh. It changes everything, or it should. He stood up. Our leaders told us we were destined to rule because of our innate superiority. What happens when that superiority exists only in propaganda? As Müller walked away, Feldwebel Wagner caught his eye from across the room and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The non-commissioned officer had been the first to volunteer assistance to the Americans, recognizing fellow craftsmen regardless of their skin color. Now, the brief exchange between him and his commanding officer acknowledged a shared understanding that transcended their military hierarchy. Meanwhile, the tank convoy had reached the rendezvous point, a farmhouse complex that had been converted into a temporary American command post. Captain Thomas Miller, commanding a company of M4 Shermans, greeted Washington as he climbed down from the Panther. "So these are the famous German cats I've been hearing about," Miller said, walking around the Panther with professional interest. "Impressive machines." "They have their strengths," Washington acknowledged, "but I'd still take a Sherman for reliability." Miller laughed. "That's because you're the one fixing them." His expression grew more serious. "We've got reports of German armor 8 miles northeast of here. A mixed group, Tigers, Panthers, and supporting infantry. They're trying to establish a corridor to allow retreat from the Ruhr pocket." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison joined them, maps in hand. "Captain, your Shermans will take the lead. Our borrowed equipment will provide heavy support. We'll coordinate with the 4th Armored Division coming in from the north to create a pincer movement." Miller looked skeptical. "Sir, with respect, how will our air support distinguish these tanks from the enemy?" "We've painted identification panels on the tops," Harrison replied, "and Air Command has been briefed, but we'll need to be extremely careful with friendly fire situations." As the officers discussed strategy, Corporal Smith approached Private Johnson, who was making final adjustments to the Panther's gun stabilizer. "How you feeling about this, Bobby?" Smith asked quietly. Johnson paused his work. "Honest? Feels strange. 3 days ago I was fixing our tanks to fight against these. Now I'm inside one, getting ready to fight with it." Smith nodded. "Know what's even stranger? Back home neither of us could get hired to drive a delivery truck. Here we are operating the most advanced tanks in the world." "For now," Johnson replied. "What happens after, when we go home? Think anything will change?" Before Smith could answer, Sergeant Washington called for them to rejoin their crew. The attack would commence in 30 minutes. As they climbed back into the Panther, Johnson glanced at the German lettering still visible on some of the controls, now supplemented with English labels hastily attached by the maintenance teams. The juxtaposition seemed symbolic of their current situation. American soldiers operating German technology, creating something new and unexpected from the collision of different worlds. The Joint Tank Force moved out at 09:30 hours, advancing in standard formation with the Shermans in the lead and the captured German tanks providing heavy support. The countryside was largely abandoned, with occasional glimpses of German civilians peering fearfully from farmhouses as the armored column passed. Inside the lead Panther, Washington maintained constant communication with his crew and the other tanks. The German machines performed admirably, their powerful engines handling the rough terrain with ease. Though the American crews were still adapting to the unfamiliar controls, their mechanical knowledge gave them a significant advantage over typical tank operators encountering a new vehicle. "Column of vehicles ahead. 2 o'clock, Johnson reported from the gunner's position. "Looks like German transport may be a kilometer out." Washington raised his binoculars. Through the commander's cupola, he could see several trucks and what appeared to be a towed anti-tank gun moving perpendicular to their advance. "They haven't spotted us yet," he observed. "They're not expecting to see Panthers coming from this direction." The radio crackled with Captain Miller's voice. "All units hold position. We'll let them pass rather than engage. Our primary objective is the armored group." The American force paused, using a line of trees for partial concealment, as the German transport moved across their front. For several tense minutes they waited, engines idling, watching to see if they had been detected. The German convoy continued, unaware of the mixed American force observing them. Once the transport had passed, the advance resumed. Less than 20 minutes later, they received reports from forward scouts that the German armored units were deploying in defensive positions around a small village 2 miles ahead. "They're digging in rather than pushing forward," Harrison noted during a brief command meeting. "That works to our advantage. Captain Miller, your Shermans will advance along this road to fix their attention. Our German tanks will swing wide to the east, then hit their flank. They won't expect Panthers to be part of an American attack force." Miller nodded. "The 4th Armored Units are in position to the north. Once we engage, they'll close the pocket." As the officers returned to their vehicles, Washington gathered his tank commanders for final instructions. "Remember, these are powerful machines, but they have vulnerabilities. Don't expose your sides. The Panthers' side armor is thin compared to the front. Communicate constantly and watch for friendly fire. American units might shoot first and identify later if they see a German tank profile." Within the hour, the operation was underway. Miller's Shermans advanced directly toward the German positions, drawing fire and attention. The sound of distant cannon fire signaled the beginning of the engagement. Washington's group of 4 German tanks moved rapidly through a wooded area, emerging behind a low ridge that would conceal their approach to the enemy's eastern flank. "All units, maintain radio discipline," Washington instructed. "We'll hold behind this ridge until Captain Miller signals that he has their full attention." The minutes stretched tensely as they waited, listening to the increasing sounds of battle. Inside each tank, the American crews performed final checks of their weapons and systems. Despite their familiarity with the mechanics, combat operation was a different challenge entirely, one that would test both their technical knowledge and their courage. Finally, the radio crackled. "Sergeant Washington, this is Captain Miller. We're heavily engaged. German armor is committed to our front. Execute flanking maneuver now." "Acknowledged," Washington responded. "All units, advance at combat speed. Maintain spacing." The 4 tanks moved forward, cresting the ridge and accelerating down the gentle slope toward the German right flank. Through his binoculars, Washington could see the battle unfolding. Several German tanks, including at least 2 Tigers, were exchanging fire with Miller's Shermans. Smoke rose from a burning vehicle, though Washington couldn't determine if it was American or German. The distance closed rapidly as the captured tanks picked up speed. At 800 meters, they were still undetected. The German forces focused entirely on the frontal engagement. "Target identified," Johnson reported from the gunner's position. "Panzer IV at the tree line, 1 o'clock. "Confirmed," Washington replied. "Fire when ready." Johnson made a final adjustment to his sight, then squeezed the trigger. The Panther's 75mm gun roared, the shell striking the Panzer IV squarely in the turret. The German tank shuddered under the impact, then erupted in flames as its ammunition detonated. The sudden attack from an unexpected direction created momentary confusion among the German forces. A Tiger tank began to rotate its turret toward the new threat, but before it could bring its 80mm gun to bear, the second American-operated Panther fired, striking the Tiger's track and immobilizing it. "All units, focus fire on those Tigers," Washington ordered. "They're the greatest threat." The battle intensified as the German commanders recognized they were being attacked from multiple directions. With American Shermans to their front and what appeared to be their own Panthers attacking their flank, their defensive position quickly became untenable. One of the American-operated Panzer IVs took a direct hit from a German anti-tank gun, the shell penetrating its frontal armor. Smoke began pouring from the hatches as the crew abandoned the damaged vehicle. "Smith, get us behind that farmhouse," Washington directed his driver. "Johnson, keep that Tiger in your sights. Don't let him bring his gun around." The Panther lurched forward, using the stone farmhouse as cover while maintaining a firing position. Johnson fired again, his shell striking the Tiger's turret ring. Though it didn't penetrate the thick armor, it damaged the traverse mechanism, preventing the German tank from rotating its gun effectively. From the north, American tank destroyers from the 4th Armored Division entered the battle, closing the trap. Caught between 3 forces, the German tanks attempted to break out to the south, but the terrain channeled them into open ground where they were exposed to fire from multiple directions. Washington's Panther pursued a retreating German tank, matching its speed across an open field. "Target locking up," Johnson reported as he tracked the enemy through his sight. "Take the shot," Washington ordered. The Panther's gun fired, the shell catching the fleeing German tank at the junction between its turret and hull. The vehicle slowed, then stopped, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. After a moment, hatches opened and crew members began to emerge with their hands raised. "Cease fire," Washington commanded. "They're surrendering." For the next hour, the battle continued as the remaining German forces were systematically reduced. The American-operated German tanks proved devastatingly effective, their heavy guns and thick frontal armor allowing them to engage enemy Tigers on equal terms, something the lighter Shermans struggled to accomplish. By early afternoon, the engagement was over. The German breakout attempt had been thoroughly defeated, with 11 enemy tanks destroyed or captured and dozens of prisoners taken. The American forces had lost 3 Shermans and one of their captured Panzers, with another Panther damaged but repairable. As the dust settled, Captain Miller approached Washington's tank, grinning broadly. "Your boys did one hell of a job, Sergeant," he called up. "Never thought I'd be glad to see Panthers on the battlefield." Washington emerged from the commander's hatch, exhausted but satisfied. "They're good machines," he acknowledged, "but it's the men inside that make the difference." The captured German tanks, now veterans of combat under American operation, were repositioned to defensive locations as engineers cleared the battlefield and medical teams tended to the wounded. The remaining German prisoners, many still in shock at having been defeated by their own technology, were assembled for transport to rear areas. Among them was an SS tank commander who stared in disbelief at the American-operated Panthers. When he realized the tanks were crewed by black soldiers, his expression twisted with rage and incomprehension. He spat on the ground and muttered something in German. A nearby American translator overheard and frowned. "He says it's impossible. That Untermenschen, subhumans, couldn't possibly operate German tanks effectively." Washington, who had approached to check on the prisoners, regarded the SS officer calmly. "Tell him we not only operated them, we improved them. The targeting mechanism on that Panther was misaligned. We corrected it this morning." When this was translated, the SS officer's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, one of the Wehrmacht prisoners, a tank mechanic, spoke up in broken English. "Is true," he said. "Factory calibration was wrong. We knew but had no time to fix." The SS officer glared at his countryman with naked hostility, but the mechanic met his gaze without flinching. The war's end was too close for the old intimidation to work effectively. As the prisoners were loaded onto transport trucks, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison arrived to assess the situation. "Excellent work, Sergeant," he said to Washington. "Headquarters is already requesting reports on how the German armor performed under our operation." "They performed well, sir," Washington replied, "but I'd still take our Shermans for an extended campaign. The Panthers are powerful, but overcomplicated. Maintenance would be a nightmare without a dedicated facility." Harrison nodded. "I'll include that in my report." He paused. "We've received new orders. Once the battlefield is secured, your tanks are to be transported to a collection point near Frankfurt. They want all captured German equipment consolidated for technical evaluation." "What about my men, sir?" "They're to accompany the vehicles. Your expertise with these machines is now considered a valuable intelligence asset." Washington absorbed this information. "And after that, sir?" Harrison understood the unasked question. "After that, we all go home, Sergeant, to whatever waits for us there." Later that evening, as the American forces established a temporary camp, Washington found Private Johnson sitting alone on the Panther's hull, staring at the battlefield in the fading light. "You did good work today," Washington said, climbing up to join him. Johnson nodded absently. "It's strange, Sergeant. This tank was built to kill us, and today we used it to kill the people who built it." "That's war," Washington replied simply. "Nothing makes much sense when you look at it closely." "I was thinking about what happens next," Johnson continued. "We've proven we can operate the most advanced tanks in the world. We've fought alongside white units as equals, but when we go home—" He trailed off. Washington sighed. "When we go home, we'll find a country that might not be ready to acknowledge what we've done here, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen." He gestured to the Panther beneath them. We mastered these machines. Nobody can take that away from us. Do you think anything will change, Sergeant? Washington was quiet for a moment before responding. Change rarely happens all at once, Johnson. But days like today, they become part of something larger. They become proof of what's possible. The conversation was interrupted by a runner informing them that Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had called a meeting for all unit leaders. As Washington made his way to the command tent, he passed a group of German prisoners being processed by military police. Among them, he recognized Hauptmann Müller, the German officer from the maintenance facility. Their eyes met briefly. Müller gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that contained a complex mixture of acknowledgement, respect, and perhaps a hint of apology. Washington returned the nod before continuing on his way. 3 days later, the captured German tanks arrived at the collection facility near Frankfurt. The massive compound contained hundreds of pieces of German military equipment being studied by Allied technical teams. The Panthers and the remaining Panzer IV were guided to a designated area where several American officers waited. A colonel from Army Ordnance stepped forward as Washington and his men climbed down from their vehicles. "Sergeant Washington, I'm Colonel Winters from Aberdeen Proving Ground. We've heard remarkable things about what you and your men accomplished with these machines." "Just doing our job, sir," Washington replied. "Hardly," Winters said with a smile. "You got these tanks operational in record time, then used them successfully in combat against their original operators. That's unprecedented." He gestured to the facility behind him. "We're conducting comprehensive analysis of German technology here. Your insights would be invaluable." "What exactly are you proposing, sir?" "I'm offering temporary assignments for you and your key personnel. 3 months with our technical teams, documenting everything you've learned about these machines, their strengths, weaknesses, and maintenance requirements." Winters looked at the assembled soldiers. "It's entirely voluntary, of course." Washington glanced at his men, seeing the interest in their expressions. For men who had spent their lives working with machinery, the opportunity to continue applying their skills was appealing. Moreover, it represented a recognition of their expertise that had often been denied them. "I think we'd be interested, sir," Washington said carefully, "provided the terms are favorable." "Excellent," Winters replied. "I'll have the paperwork drawn up immediately." Over the following weeks, Washington and his team worked closely with Allied technical experts, disassembling and analyzing the German tanks they had operated in combat. Their practical knowledge complemented the theoretical expertise of the engineers, creating a comprehensive understanding of the machine's capabilities and limitations. Corporal Smith became particularly valued for his insights into the Panther's transmission system, while Private Johnson's welding techniques were documented as field repair procedures for damaged engine blocks. Sergeant Washington oversaw the entire process, ensuring that every aspect of their experience was properly recorded for future reference. During this time, news arrived of Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was officially over, though the Pacific conflict continued. For the men of the maintenance unit, the announcement brought relief but also uncertainty about what would follow. One afternoon in late May, Washington was supervising the disassembly of a Panther's turret mechanism when Colonel Winters approached with a visitor, a middle-aged civilian in an expensive suit. "Sergeant Washington, this is Mr. Howard Mitchell from General Motors," Winters introduced them. "He's here to observe our technical evaluation of the German equipment." Mitchell extended his hand. "Colonel Winters has been telling me about your work with these tanks, Sergeant. Very impressive." Washington shook the offered hand, noting the man's appraising gaze. "Thank you, sir." "I understand you were a mechanic before the war?" Mitchell inquired. "Yes, sir. Worked on assembly lines in Detroit for 5 years." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "And what are your plans after your discharge?" Washington's expression remained neutral. "Haven't given it much thought yet, sir. Still have work to do here." "Of course," Mitchell replied. "But when you do start thinking about it, I'd appreciate a conversation. We're expanding our technical division, and men with your practical experience with advanced machinery would be valuable assets." After Mitchell departed, Corporal Smith approached. "Was that a job offer, Sergeant?" "Something like that," Washington replied cautiously. We'll see if it amounts to anything real." "Things might be changing," Smith suggested. "Maybe," Washington acknowledged, "or maybe they just need our skills badly enough to overlook other considerations, for now." The technical assignment concluded in August 1945, shortly after news of Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings. The war was completely over, and the long process of demobilization accelerated. For Washington and his men, the time had come to return to civilian life. On their final day at the facility, Colonel Winters called Washington to his office. "Sergeant, I wanted to personally thank you for your contributions. Your team's insights have been invaluable." "Glad to be of service, sir." Winters handed him a folder. "These are letters of commendation for you and your key personnel. I've also taken the liberty of including some contacts in the civilian sector who have expressed interest in hiring men with your technical expertise." He paused. "The world is changing, Washington. Not as quickly as it should, perhaps, but the war has shifted many old certainties." Washington accepted the folder. "I appreciate that, sir." "There's one more thing," Winters added. "We received a communication from a former German officer, a Hauptmann Müller. He was apparently the commander at the facility where you first worked on these tanks." Washington's expression registered surprise. "What did he want?" "He's being processed for repatriation and requested permission to send a message to the American maintenance personnel who repaired the German tanks." Winters opened a drawer and removed a sheet of paper. "It's been translated and cleared by intelligence." Washington took the offered paper. The message was brief but clear. "To Sergeant Washington and his men, what you demonstrated through skill and knowledge has had more impact than any propaganda. Some lessons take time to be fully understood, but they are not forgotten. With professional respect, Werner Müller." Washington carefully folded the note and placed it in his pocket. "Thank you for passing this along, sir." As he left the office, Washington found his men waiting outside, their bags packed, ready to begin the journey home. Private Johnson stepped forward. "What happens now, Sergeant?" Washington looked at the young men who had performed mechanical miracles under combat conditions, who had mastered enemy technology and turned it against its creators, who had demonstrated excellence when many doubted their basic competence. "Now," Washington said, "we take what we learned here and apply it back home. One machine, one job, one day at a time." He smiled slightly. "And we remember that we operated the most advanced tanks in the world and did it better than the people who built them." 6 months later, Eugene Washington stood in the personnel office of the Fisher Body Plant in Detroit, his discharge papers and letters of recommendation in hand. The personnel manager, a middle-aged white man named Collins, reviewed the documents with a furrowed brow. "These are impressive recommendations, Mr. Washington," Collins acknowledged, "especially this one from Howard Mitchell at corporate headquarters." "Thank you, sir." Collins seemed to be wrestling with an internal decision. "We do have positions open in the technical division. Not many Negroes working in that department, though." "I'm qualified for the work," Washington stated simply. Collins nodded slowly. "Yes, you certainly appear to be." He stamped a form and handed it to Washington. "Report to Building C tomorrow morning at 7. You'll start as a technical inspector. The pay is 30% higher than assembly line work." As Washington exited the building, he found William Smith waiting outside. His former corporal had already secured a position at the plant through similar recommendations. "How'd it go?" Smith asked. Washington held up the stamped form. "Technical Inspector, Building C." Smith whistled. "That's a good position. Better than mine." "For now," Washington replied with a slight smile. "I have bigger plans." "Like what?" Washington gazed at the massive factory complex before them, American industry transitioning from wartime to peacetime production, retooling for a new era. "I was thinking about some improvements to the transmission systems based on what we learned from those Panthers. Might have to draw up some proposals." Smith laughed. "Already planning to redesign the place and you haven't even started yet." "Why not?" Washington responded. "We fixed German tanks under combat conditions. Detroit assembly lines should be straightforward by comparison." As they walked toward the streetcar stop, Washington reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here, from a segregated maintenance unit to operating captured enemy tanks to a technical position that would have been unthinkable for a black man before the war. The path hadn't been straight or easy, and there were still many barriers ahead, but something fundamental had shifted. In a maintenance facility in Germany, Wehrmacht officers had fallen silent as black American tankers repaired their prized Panzers with unprecedented speed and skill. That silence had contained the collapse of a worldview, a moment when propaganda yielded to observable reality. Such moments, Washington believed, contained the seeds of larger changes, even if those changes would take time to fully manifest. For now, he had machines to inspect, improvements to suggest, and skills to demonstrate. One day at a time, one mechanism at a time, proving through action what words alone could never convey. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.